I had been searching for her for what felt like a lifetime. Snow White, the princess of the neighboring kingdom. Stories of her beauty spread like wildfire through the lands. But it wasn't until a diplomatic visit to her castle that I saw her for the first time. It was fleeting, just a moment in passing. But in that instant, my heart belonged to her. She was unlike anyone I had ever seen, a vision of purity and grace. I returned to her kingdom soon after, but the Snow White I had seen was no longer at the castle. I heard whispers from the servants, rumors of an evil queen and a terrible curse. They said Snow White had fallen under the spell of the queen's dark magic and had disappeared, her fate uncertain. Dead or alive, no one knew for sure. I had to find her. The thought of her suffering, or worse, gone forever, haunted my every waking moment. It was all I could think about. So I ventured into the deep forest, where I heard she was lying in a strange, enchanted sleep, guarded by the 7 dwarves who once sheltered her. When I arrived at the clearing, my heart raced. There she was, inside a glass coffin, her body untouched by time or decay. Snow White lay as if merely sleeping, her beauty preserved, unblemished by death. Her skin was still as pale as snow, her lips red like blood, and her hair black as ebony. She was perfect. My heart swelled with purpose. The dwarfs told me that only the kiss of true love could break the curse. I didn't hesitate. I stepped forward, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down on me. I knelt beside her and lowered my lips to hers, pressing them against the cold softness of her mouth. But the kiss felt wrong. Her lips were as cold as ice, like kissing the surface of a frozen lake. Still, I refused to believe anything could be wrong. This was a fairy tale. I was her prince. My kiss would wake her, and we would live happily ever after. The dwarfs watched in silence, and I waited. But nothing happened. No flutter of eyelashes, no breath of life. She remained still. I couldn't accept it. I was meant to save her. So I took her from the glass coffin, carried her fragile body back to my kingdom, and declared her my bride. No one dared object, though many whispered behind closed doors that something was deeply wrong. They didn't understand. They couldn't feel what I felt. I loved her. She was my Snow White, and nothing would change that. At the palace, I dressed her in the finest gowns, sat her by my side at the grand dining table, and arranged her hair each morning. Her lips, which I painted a deep red, stood out against the paleness of her skin. I made sure she looked as beautiful as ever. But she never moved. She never spoke. Her glassy eyes stared at me, unblinking, unseeing. At night, I would hold her cold body close, whispering to her about the life we would build once the curse finally broke. But as the days passed, I began to feel something strange. A weakness in my body, a sickness creeping under my skin. At first, it was just fatigue, but soon sores began to appear, red, festering wounds. And I wasn't the only one. The servants grew sick too, their skin cracking and bleeding. The palace became a house of rot. Whispers spread through the kingdom. People began to say that Snow White was cursed, that her lifeless body was spreading a plague. They wanted her gone. They feared her, called her a harbinger of disease, and demanded that she be destroyed. But I couldn't let them take her from me. She was my princess, my bride, and I loved her more than anything. Yet, as my body weakened and the sores multiplied, I could no longer stand against the growing mob. One night, they stormed the palace. dragging Snow White's lifeless body from her bed. I screamed at them to stop, but my voice was weak, barely more than a rasp. They took her deep into the forest and built a pyre. I couldn't let my Snow White suffer like that. I pushed myself from the bed, ignoring the pain tearing through my limbs, and ran after them, the world spinning around me. By the time I reached the clearing, flames were already licking at the edges of her gown. The heat was unbearable, but I couldn't stop myself. I rushed into the fire, ignoring the screams of the villagers. Snow White lay in the center of the inferno, her face still calm and beautiful despite the flames consuming her. I reached for her, pulling her into my arms, but as I held her, her body began to disintegrate. Her perfect skin crumbled into ash beneath my fingers, her beautiful face turning to dust. The harder I clutched her, the more she fell apart, until all that was left of my Snow White was a pile of grey, lifeless ash. In the end, all I could do was hold on to the ashes of my beloved, even as the flames consumed me.
The house was strangely quiet as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner. Because my husband was away on a business trip for 3 days, leaving me alone with our daughter, Nana. I missed him, of course, but it felt nice to have some mother-daughter time. As I stirred the pot, I couldn't help but smile, thinking of how adorable Nana looked in the little purple dress I had helped her put on earlier. She had insisted on wearing it all day, twirling around the living room, her laughter echoing through the house. The smell of food filled the air, and I began setting the table, calling out to Nana. "Dinner's ready, sweetheart." I waited for her usual response, a cheerful,
"Coming, Mommy,"
but was met with silence. Strange. Nana was always quick to come when food was involved. I called out again, a little louder this time, but there was still no answer. Wiping my hands on a towel, I headed upstairs to her room, assuming she had fallen asleep. As I approached the door, I noticed a strange stillness in the air, an unnatural quiet that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Pushing the door of Nana's room open, I tried to flick on the light switch, but the room remained dark. "Nana," I called softly, stepping into the room. A shiver ran down my spine as I noticed something odd. There were several dolls in the room that I hadn't seen before. They sat on the bed, the dresser, and even the floor, their glassy eyes reflecting the dim light. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized them. These were the same dolls I used to play with as a child, the ones I had forgotten about after all these years. How did they get here? Before I could process the unsettling sight, a voice broke the silence.
"Mommy, it's tea time."
The words were barely a whisper, but they sent a chill down my spine. I turned toward the sound and saw Nana sitting at her small tea table, her back facing me. She was perfectly still, her little hands resting on the table in front of her. "Nana, are you okay, sweetie?" I asked, my voice trembling. Something about her posture was wrong, too rigid, too unnatural. As I took a step closer, I noticed that the dolls were now positioned in a circle around her, their lifeless eyes fixed on me. I hesitated, a cold dread seeping into my bones. I reached out to touch Nana's shoulder, but as soon as my fingers brushed her skin, she collapsed onto the floor like a rag doll. What was going on with my Nana? I was shocked as I saw her face. Half of the skin was missing, revealing muscle and tissue. Her nails had been ripped off, leaving her tiny fingers bloody and raw. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. But before I could react, I heard it again. That soft, chilling voice.
"Mom, it's tea time."
I spun around, my eyes wide with terror. There was no one there, just the dolls sitting motionless, yet I could feel their presence, their eyes boring into me. I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was this some twisted nightmare? Then I saw it. From the shadows, a doll began to move. It was the headless one. It was dressed in a miniature version of the same purple dress Nana had been wearing. The doll's tiny hands clutched a tea tray as it glided toward me, moving with an unnatural grace.
Why did you leave me, Mommy?
The voice was childlike, but it held a dark, sinister undertone. The doll stopped in front of me, raising its tray as if offering me a cup of tea. I staggered back, shaking my head in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. I tried to scream to call for help, but no sound came out. The dolls closed in, surrounding me, their tiny hands reaching out, grasping at my clothes, pulling me down. I kicked and struggled, but their grip was iron strong, unyielding.
Mommy, don't you want to play with me?
The headless doll asked, its voice now coming from all directions, echoing inside my skull. I felt cold metal press against my thigh, and I looked down in horror to see another doll holding a small, sharp knife, its eyes glinting with malice. The knife plunged into my leg, the pain searing through my body. I screamed, thrashing wildly, but the dolls pinned me down, their weight crushing, suffocating. They dragged me toward the tea table, forcing me to sit in the tiny chair. The headless doll climbed onto the table, its small hands meticulously arranging the tea set. More disgusting, it took one of Nana's nails, bloodied and torn, and carefully placed it on its own tiny finger, as if completing itself with pieces of my daughter. I sobbed, my mind fracturing under the relentless terror. Please, just let me go. But the dolls only smiled, their expressions twisted into cruel mockeries of joy.
Tea time, Mommy. Tea time, Mommy. Tea time, Mommy.
They chorused in unison, their voices blending into a cacophony of madness. Just when I thought the nightmare couldn't get worse, my eyes wide with terror and saw two dolls approaching, carrying a tray between them. On the tray sat a head, my old doll's head, the one I had played with as a child. But it was no longer the pristine, beautiful doll I remembered. The head was rotted, the skin cracked and peeled, one eye missing, the other milky white. The two dolls placed the tray beside the headless doll's body, their movements eerily synchronized. I watched in horror as they lifted the decayed head and attached it to the body, twisting it grotesquely until it clicked into place. For a moment, everything was still. Then slowly the head began to turn. The doll's mouth cracked open, and in a raspy, distorted voice, it whispered,
Welcome back, Mommy.
911, we need help! There's something wrong! There are only 5 of us on this camping trip, but we keep counting 6 and we don't know who he is. Oh God, I don't know what's going on. Josh was killed and Alex and Sam were lost in the woods, and Henry, I'm not sure. Please send help. I am Hannah, along with Josh, Henry, Sam, and Alex. We have been friends since freshman year of high school and decided to go camping to celebrate our graduation. When we arrived, we began setting up our tents. Henry quickly finished setting his tent and went to find firewood. Josh was reading the tent setup instructions, while Alex and Sam were busy putting up their tent. I am sure that at that moment there were only 5 of us, and I knew each one well. Suddenly a red light flashed, and I joked that it might be a UFO coming to Earth. But shortly after, everything became eerily cold. The sun had set, and the silence was overwhelming. We sat around the campfire for warmth, but the feeling of safety quickly vanished. Josh looked around for Henry but couldn't find him. I heard footsteps behind me and thought Henry had returned. We relaxed, but the atmosphere grew tense. Henry appeared suddenly, asking why we hadn't gotten a chair for him. We had arranged 5 chairs around the campfire, so there shouldn't have been a 6th person. The more I tried to explain, the more confused my thoughts became, as if someone was draining my thoughts. We felt the presence of someone we couldn't see. I watched everyone. They all sensed something was happening. Sam and Alex expressed their anxiety while Josh and Henry couldn't hide their fear. Henry broke the silence. "Okay, I'll get my own chair." I stood up and offered to help him. As we walked away from the campfire towards the tents, I asked Henry how many people were there. He nervously replied, 5, or rather 5 chairs. Every time I thought about the 6th person, my thoughts became uncontrollable. It was like waking up from a dream and forcing myself to remember it, but I couldn't. Each time I thought about the 6th person, I felt a sharp pain. We returned to the campfire to find 2 empty chairs for Henry and me. Everything seemed normal now, even though it hadn't before. Sam suggested we might be tired from the long trip and needed some rest. Perhaps she was right. We were all sleep-deprived from waking up early to get here. Alex brought out some drinks and we sat closer to the fire, sipping and warming ourselves. The feeling of safety and comfort returned, but it didn't last long. "Wait, who started the fire?" I asked. Everyone looked at me uncomfortably, but no one answered. I looked around at my friends, all appearing blurry in the firelight. "Wasn't it you, Henry?" Josh asked, but Henry shook his head. "I think the person behind Hannah did it," Sam said, looking at me. My heart pounded. I slowly turned around, but there was nothing behind me except darkness. Alex suggested we should leave. Someone mentioned it was too dark, and we could get lost if we left now. Josh suggested that we should pair up and sleep together instead of separated tent. That way no one would be alone tonight. We paired up. I was with Henry, Sam with Alex. Josh said he didn't have a partner, but we reassured him that he did. I didn't know why we said that, why we kept thinking about the 6th person. Sam suggested arranging the tents in a U-shape so the entrances were close together, limiting access. Everyone settled into their tents. Although Josh was alone, he felt okay because our tents were close together. But maybe Josh was just pretending to be brave. I deeply regretted letting Josh sleep alone. He was the least integrated into the group, and he knew that none of us were with him. Before going to sleep, we agreed to leave as soon as the sun rose. Alex's scream woke us up in the middle of the night. Henry and I opened our tent to find Sam and Alex staring at Josh's tent. Josh was still in his sleeping bag. His face was twisted in pain, and his nails had been removed, with black blood dripping. The rest of his body was curled up in the sleeping bag. Alex was in shock, his eyes unfocused. Sam shook him repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Henry grabbed a flashlight, shouted, and told us to get up and run. We abandoned everything and ran away from the campsite. The 5 of us ran as fast as we could, with Henry leading, using the weak flashlight to guide us. And then Alex tripped and sprained his ankle. We all stopped. Someone said he knew how to make a splint for Alex and dragged him into the forest. Everything happened too quickly. Sam followed Alex's cries despite Henry trying to stop her. I wanted to follow Sam, but Henry grabbed my shoulder and shook me hard, urging me to leave. We kept running and running, but after a while, someone was quickly following us. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. My legs were burning. Henry looked back at me, yelling at me to keep running. He pulled a small knife from his pocket, handed me the car keys, and then turned back, throwing the knife at the person chasing us. I kept running in fear, stumbling along the path for hours. I didn't allow myself to stop. When I saw the familiar parking lot, I almost cried. I rushed to the car, started it, and quickly drove out of the forest and onto the highway. Now I'm waiting for 911 to arrive. I don't think they'll believe my story, but they said they sent a car. The sun is starting to rise. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw someone sitting in the back seat. We locked eyes.